Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, speaking of fossil fuels, the Supreme Court wants to gut regulatory agencies, or at least the 6 conservatives, the 6 Republican whack jobs on the Supreme Court want to gut any kind of federal agency that can regulate things like greenhouse gases or regulate banks or investment houses, you know, the places where the billionaires make their piles of money. Specifically, they're going after the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, or Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, saying that because they get their funding from the Fed, they're not constitutional. Now, they made this argument before the Supreme Court yesterday. And it looks like Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts may not be going along with the hardcore right-wingers on this. And the reason why is the attorneys for the CFPB made the point that if you strike down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as unconstitutional because their funding does not come from a specific congressional appropriation but comes via the Fed, then you're going to have to shut down the Fed too, because it gets funding the same way. And you're going to have to shut down the U.S. Mint because it gets funding the same way. And you're going to have to shut down Social Security because it gets funding the same way. So here we have now billionaire-funded Republican think tanks going before the Supreme Court today saying you've got to shut down Social Security because of the way it's funded. And I just don't think that, you know, as crazed as these guys are on the Supreme Court, I think they have learned a lesson from the Dobbs decision, which is that, you know, you can go pretty far. But there is a point that when you exceed that point, it blows up in your face. And they're starting to get a little concerned about that. The argument that was made by this attorney, Noel Francisco, who is representing the Community Financial Services Association of America, this is the payday lenders, the parasites. You know, he came out and he said, Congress has not determined the amount that this agency should be spending. Instead, it is delegated to the director the authority to pick his own appropriation. How, you know, essentially, how dare they? Well, they dare. But then Ketanji Brown Jackson said, and I quote in the hearing, she said, I'm a little worried, I think, about a separation of powers problem that may occur if the judiciary gets involved with telling Congress when and under what circumstances it can exercise its own prerogatives concerning funding. How do we avoid the judiciary suddenly becoming a super legislator, just telling Congress agency by agency whether it's thumbs up or thumbs down? And then Brett Kavanaugh said, you know, Congress said how the CFPB is funded and they can change it tomorrow. What's the problem here? Essentially. Senator Elizabeth Warren, you know, really pointed out the gist of this, which is the point that I made just a moment ago. She said, and I quote, the future of Social Security, Medicare, and every federal banking regulator is under grave threat if payday lenders and Wall Street banks get the Supreme Court to undermine the CFPB. She said the CFPB is under attack because it's an effective watchdog, returning over $17 billion back into the pockets of hardworking Americans who were cheated. So here's the equation that these payday lenders and these other banksters are making. They lose $17 billion of fraud that they would have been able to keep the money from had there not been a cop on the beat. But they have to give that money back because they were convicted or they were found to have committed crimes. $17 billion. So if they can get rid of the CFPB, they get to keep $17 billion. Well, hey, if you're going to keep $17 billion, you take at least $500 million of that, $500 million of it, and start pouring it like fairy dust, sprinkling it like fairy dust all over members of Congress and the Supreme Court. Time to take Clarence Thomas on another vacay. Right? Don't you see this happening? I mean, the Supreme Court legalized political bribery, not only of members of Congress, but of themselves. They said it's legal to bribe a member of the Supreme Court. There's a reason nobody's prosecuting Clarence Thomas for taking all those gifts, or Sam Alito for going on that fishing trip with the hedge fund billionaire, Paul Singer. There's a reason why, you know, they're not being prosecuted for this, because they legalized it, by and large. There's a reason why all the outrage that Democrats, well, Americans in general, are directing toward the Supreme Court is not in the context of why aren't these guys in jail. Instead, it's in the context of why don't they have a code of ethics? Because they legalized political bribery with Citizens United. After Clarence Thomas had been, sucked up to for years and years and years, and by Harlan Crow, by a right-wing billionaire. This should not be complicated at all. So how's the Supreme Court going to rule on this? Well, it's going to be interesting, because if they rule one way, it's going to be a defeat for the banksters. And if they rule the other way, it's probably going to lead to the end of Social Security, which, you and I both know the Republicans have been begging for ways to end Social Security ever since 1935 when it was put into law.